These are challenging times for us all. I think it would be nice to imagine an America where we could all look forward to a moment of national unity in the face of an external threat, like a global pandemic, or in the face of an economic crisis, or even after a national election. But we all know that that is not likely, not in America, not now. It seems like we're more divided right now than we have been at any time in recent memory. The question is why? So I want to talk about one part of the answer. I don't think we can really fully explain our divisions without addressing the rise of Christian nationalism in America. Christian nationalism is not on the fringes of American political life anymore. It is at the center of power. Now, other speakers today will no doubt have a lot to say about what Christian nationalism is. So I'd like to say something about what it is not. The first thing to know is that religious nationalism is not religion. Religious nationalism makes use of religion, but it's not just trying to achieve religious, social, or cultural aims. It is also trying to achieve political power. Now, let me say something else about what the movement is not. It's not just about evangelicals. Now, certainly it includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too. It excludes a significant number of white evangelicals and an overwhelming number of evangelicals of color. It has been shaped in profound ways by certain aspects of Catholicism. And it's strange to say Christian nationalism receives some forms of support from some individuals and groups that do not identify as Christian at all. Here's the third thing the movement is not. It is not a movement that's merely about symbolism. It's not merely about the expression of sincerely held beliefs in the public square. The thing that's at stake in the rise of Christian nationalism is not whether we merely blur the line between church and state or offend the feelings of an outgroup. The thing that is at stake is the most fundamental organization of our political system. It is about whether the United States will continue as a constitutional democracy in a pluralistic society united by an idea, the idea of a democratic republic or not. There are those political leaders that embrace the pluralism and diversity of our nation and attempt to advance their values in the public sphere by appealing to non- or extra-religious values that the diverse public at large may hold in common. And then there are those that seek to use the power of the state to impose the supposedly correct religious viewpoints on everyone else. And they seek to commandeer the public resources for themselves. I think of the latter as advocates for Christian nationalism, whose proponents make use of theological frameworks in order to justify political power over other people and groups. And political movements are, by their nature, very complex. And this particular movement is more complex than most. It is not organized around any single central institution. It consists rather of a dense ecosystem of nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, both religious and non-religious groups. Many of the movement's leading figures have entrenched themselves into the highest levels of our governing institutions in ways that will long outlast the current administration. The leadership cadre and their supporters and allies have spent many hundreds of millions of dollars over decades building advocacy organizations, policy groups, legal activist groups, think tanks, messaging platforms, sophisticated data initiatives, all the features of modern political campaign infrastructure. I lay out much of this ecosystem in my book, The Power Worshippers, and I also focus on some of the most intriguing leading personalities of the movement. But the most important thing to understand about their collective effort is not its variety, but the profound source of its unity. The leaders often insist they're defending absolute truth, but many of us understand what they're actually doing is a kind of partisan activism, one that seeks to concentrate power in the hands of a new leadership, a new elite. In election seasons, the movement acts to transform many of America's conservative churches into what are essentially partisan political cells. So I want to talk a little bit about how the machinery targets churches and targets faith leaders. leaders of the movement have figured out that pastors drive vote. People tend to trust their pastors and religious leaders. And so the key movement leaders and organizations seek to organize pastors into networks in order to get them all on the same page politically. They figure if you can get the pastors, you can get the people. They'll tell the people how to vote. So I want to give you an idea of what this looks like on the ground. I attended a pastors networking event at a church in rural North Carolina with dozens of evangelical pastors from the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter in elections and the biblically correct way to vote on them. The event was organized by Watchmen on the Wall. It's a project of the Family Research Council, one of the most powerful policy groups of the Christian right. Watchmen on the Wall has tens of thousands of affiliated pastor members. So from the moment I stepped into the church, I could tell that this was not really a politically neutral affair. Family Research Council President Tony Perkins, who said, spoke at the event, he said, "I believe this last election, 2016, was the result of prayer. We've seen our nation begin to move back to a nation that respects the sanctity of life." So what he's signaling here to these pastors in the room is that the single issue that matters most, that pastors should care about the most, is abortion. They notice if you can get people to vote on a single issue, or maybe one or two issues, 3 issues at most, you can control their vote. Then pastors were instructed to form culture impact teams. The idea is for pastors to create within their churches teams of congregants that will, as they describe it, advance kingdom values in the public arena. So pastors are instructed to figure out which members of their congregation are politically active, well connected to other members, and motivated to get them to vote according to their biblical values. Then they give them very sophisticated tools to do that. A friend of mine who's a pastor at a church affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention tells me that he's receiving an extraordinary volume of emails and tools some of which he's forwarded to me, including sample voter guides sent by the Faith and Freedom Coalition. That's an organization led by Ralph Reed, who's promised to devote $40 million to the current election cycle. This voter guide leaves no question as to how he, my friend, is expected to direct his congregants to vote their so-called biblical values. There are, maybe 6 sample questions. 2 of them are about abortion, and others are worded in such a way that it's absolutely, shows the pastors which issues they should communicate to their congregants. Very, very straightforward. So there's another tool developed by the Family Research Council. It's actually, I have a copy of this here. It's one of the most, Family Research Council, again, is one of the most powerful, influential policy groups of the religious right. This is a culture impact team. It's about, team manual, it's about 200 pages of instructions. So they're not just telling people to get out and motivate other congregants to vote. They're not just saying to the pastors, you need to tell your congregants that they need to vote their biblical values on abortion. They give them these incredibly sophisticated tools and resources and messaging materials to help them do that. This Culture Impact Team Manual has about 200 pages of material, and it's really very comprehensive. A fundamental motivation behind these types of tools that they give these pastors is to get around IRS guidelines that say pastors shouldn't be endorsing candidates from the pulpit. But nothing stops congregants from their own church-based activism if it's all about the culture. So several years ago, a pastor I interviewed about this type of initiative called it a God-given loophole. He said it threads a separation of church and state loophole, sort of getting around those IRS guidelines that justify tax exemption. So let me tell you something else about the political messaging of movement leaders. As we know, when they're talking to the congregants or talking to pastors about getting out the vote, among congregants, it's a lot of it is about abortion. In fact, I heard one leader tell a group of Latino pastors, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you got to say to them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? When you put it that way, it's very leading. So I wish I had more to say, more time to say something about the history of the abortion issue here. I don't, because we all have limited time, but I will say something about it, and it's central to understanding Christian nationalism. The story we've come to accept is that the religious right came together around widespread opposition to abortion, and this arose from the grassroots up. But this gets the causality almost exactly backwards. Christian nationalism came first, and it created, I should say, a sort of hyper-conservative counter-revolution, or the rise of a movement called the New Right came first. And it created the abortion issue as we now know it, as an us versus them issue, in order to serve political purposes. And then it used this political construction to change the theology and religion that it pretended to represent. And we think that politics of the culture wars are an effect of the religion, but the reality is that very often the way the religion is represented is to a disturbing degree an effect of the politics. Let's remember that in 1973, when Roe versus Wade was passed, most Republican Protestants supported it, supported some form of abortion law liberalization. It was only a great effort and an effort to unite conservative, sort of hyper-conservative Protestants and conservative Catholics that created the abortion issue as the political issue we see today. When you look at the political messages in detail, and especially the messages that the movement leadership sends to one another and to elites in power, it's not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible favors low taxes or no taxes for the rich, how the Bible favors minimal government or no government, about how the Bible is against, I wouldn't say no government, no government funding of social services and things like that, about how the Bible is against funding the social safety net. Against the social safety net is managed by the church, which is receiving public money directly for the purpose, unless the money is flowing first through houses of worship and then helping people who need services. So I learned a lot about the movement and money when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger. He's the founder of Capital Ministries, who targets political leaders at the top levels of government. Drollinger's weekly Bible study group in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 out of 15 former and current members of Trump's cabinet. He also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate and House of Representatives. So he's arguably one of the most politically influential pastors today. The expansiveness of Drollinger's positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy hits home the fact that this is a political movement, not merely a stance in the so-called culture wars. Drollinger weighs in on a number of social and economic policy questions, including the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in Scripture, and he favors tax policies that benefit the very rich. Now, these teachings reflect an underappreciated fact about the movement, which is its long-standing alliance with a libertarian far-right economic wing of the Republican Party. Many members of the rank and file who end up voting their values on, say, abortion, or they think they're defending the American family, they would in fact want to keep their coverage for pre-existing conditions and healthcare plans. They themselves might benefit from higher minimum wages or worker protections or better funded public schools for their kids. Religious right claims to stand for the American family, but many of the economic policies they endorse are intensifying economic inequality, which is, by the way, today at record levels, destabilizing society and actually making it harder for American families to succeed. These economic positions are echoed among other movement leaders, including David Barton. I write a lot about David Barton in my book. I call him the Where's Waldo of the movement because he sits on the boards of so many of its key initiatives. I know David Brockman will have more to say about Barton here. He's a sort of pseudo-historian, in my view, who sort of manufactures an imagined past of America. He too has argued that the Bible and God oppose progressive income taxes, capital gains taxes, and minimum wage laws. In an essay titled "The Bible, Slavery, and America's Founders," Barton writes, "Different forms of slavery have replaced the more obvious system of past centuries." He adds, "The state has assumed the role of master for many, providing aid and assistance, and with it more and more control to those unable to provide for themselves. The only solution to slavery is the liberty of the gospel. So you see here, Barton is casting forms of government assistance, things like job training and healthcare and aid to women with infant children. He's casting this as a form of so-called slavery. I mean, in my view, this is just wrong on so many levels. But while movement leaders oppose what they call government handouts to the poor, they have no trouble at all with directing the flow of taxpayer money to faith-based organizations, which receive public money already through subsidies, tax deductions, grants, vouchers, and other means. And now, thanks to the current administration's policies, have additional sources of public money. So they don't want to fund their own, like a soup kitchen, a non-sectarian soup kitchen, but they'd be happy to fund a church, which can then run a soup kitchen and also be free in many instances, depending on how the form of aid is delivered, will maintain the right to proselytize along with offering food aid. So now I want to shift a bit to discussing one of the legislative initiatives I write about in my book. Are any of you are aware of the organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or the Americans United for Life? It's an anti-abortion organization. These organizations craft pieces of model legislation that allow legislators to easily introduce bills in different states without needing to research and write the bills themselves. They kind of get everyone with the same political vision on the same page. So if a legislator in a state who happens to be pro-life wants to introduce some form of legislation that's going to limit access to abortion rights, she or he will be able to, turn to the work of Americans United for Life and find their model legislation and introduce that bill. Project Blitz works along similar lines. The idea is to overwhelm state legislatures with so many religiously oriented bills that some of them can be expected to get through in the center of the debate, get shifted to the right. The ultimate aim is to get a license for certain faith groups to discriminate against certain other groups and conflate in the minds of the public their religion with the authority of the government. It's a way of signaling to everyone through the law that there is a group that is privileged in society, one with so-called correct beliefs, and other groups that are not deserving of privilege. These initiatives are often cast in the language of religious liberty, but they are expressions of religious privilege. What today's Christian nationalists want is a trump card to overrule the law where it conflicts with their religious beliefs, and thus to withdraw from the social contract that binds the rest of us together as a nation. Ironically, it was the late Justice Antonin Scalia who saw the danger best when he ruled in the 1990 case Employment Division versus Smith that to make an individual's obedience to the law contingent upon the law's coincidence with his religious beliefs amounts to permitting him, by virtue of his beliefs, to be a law unto himself. This, said Scalia, contradicts both constitutional tradition and common sense. Scalia rightly suggested that simply allowing your own religious beliefs to decide which laws you should or should not follow would be courting anarchy. Now that case centered on the question of whether a pair of Native Americans had violated a state ban on the use of peyote, even though their use of the drug was part of a religious ritual. So they said, we want to be able to, we know peyote is illegal, but it's part of our religion, so we want to be able to use it. And Scalia said nonsense. When the demands of Native Americans were switched out for those of religious nationalists, however, Scalia and his fellows rapidly lost sight of the insight, lost track of the insight. So when we look at what's happening in the United States, we often consider it in purely American terms, including religious nationalism. But what we are seeing here is a process that is already playing out in other countries. It is more or less happening in Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and Russia, where political leaders in those countries bind themselves tightly to ultra-conservative religious leaders in order to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. This has happened throughout history. It's what happened with Mussolini in Italy, an atheist who happily fathered children out of wedlock and then made Catholicism the state religion. Religious nationalists always run identity campaigns to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. There's a we that is under threat. There is a they that we hate, and religion tends to play a vital role in distinguishing the two groups. So it's a form of identity politics, in a way. From Franco in Spain to Salazar in Portugal, right-wing strongmen have long allied on alliances with conservative religious movements to sustain their strict regimes. In broad outlines, what we're seeing in America today follows a very familiar pattern with world history. When countries fall apart or become unstable, religious demagogues and forms of religious nationalism often emerge to exploit the situation. They appeal to the anxieties of a militant minority or plurality, and they wield those grievances against democracy, using them as a weapon to establish authoritarian systems of power. In conclusion, I appreciate that some of the claims I am making may seem pessimistic, but speaking just for myself, I consider myself an optimist. I still believe we have the resources to think deeply and deliberately about who and what we are as a republic. In fact, I take it as this being the reason why you are here too, and this is why we're having this discussion. So thank you again for your participation.